Lesson 11-5 Congruent Triangles, and in this lesson you learn to identify congruent triangles and corresponding sides of congruent triangles. And let's start. The figures that have the same side and shape, they're called congruent, meaning they have the same measure. Okay, so if they have the same size, that means they have the same measure in terms of the sides and the angles. So if they have the same size and they have the same shape, they're called congruent figures. So the triangles shown below are congruent. Okay, the slash marks are used to indicate which sides are congruent, and arcs are used to indicate which angles are congruent. Okay, so remember the symbol, an equal sign with a squiggly line on top means is congruent to. So that's what that symbol means. Now let's take a look at the slash marks. So this slash mark indicates that this side is congruent to that side. Why? Because they both have one slash mark each. And this side has two slash marks, so it is congruent to this side because they both have two slash marks. And this side is congruent to that side because both of them have three slash marks each. In terms of the angles, this angle is congruent to this angle, okay, because they both have the same slash mark. This angle is congruent to that angle because they have two slash marks each, and angle R is congruent to angle Z because they have three slash marks each. So from what you saw, the congruent angles are angle P and angle X are congruent. Okay, angle Q is congruent to angle Y, and angle R is congruent to angle Z. Okay, so the congruent sides also we mentioned. Segment PQ is congruent to segment XY, PQ, XY right there. Segment OR, okay, QR is congruent to segment YZ, and finally segment PR is congruent to segment XZ. So parts of the congruent triangles that match are called corresponding parts. When they say they match, that means they are in the same location of the triangle. Okay, so when they say, it says here they match, okay, talks about the same location or position. Okay, so they have the same location or position in the triangle. So in this case, this side corresponds to that side because they are in the same position or location in the triangle. Side QR corresponds to side QZ because they are in the same position or location. And if you notice, when you talk about congruent sides, okay, it's usually that also not only are they congruent, they're also corresponding parts. Okay, so for example, in triangle above, angle P corresponds to angle X because they are in the same position or location, and side PQ corresponds to side XY, or segment PQ corresponds to segment XY. Okay, so let's move on. From that, we can now talk about corresponding parts of congruent triangles, okay, which simply means that if two triangles are congruent, their corresponding sides are congruent and their corresponding angles are congruent. So when you write triangle PQR is congruent to triangle XYZ, the corresponding vertices are written in order. So triangle PQR is congruent to triangle XYZ. Now this seems very trivial, but remember this, when you say two triangles are congruent, the corresponding vertices, okay, so the corresponding vertices, let me underline that for you, okay, because this is important. The corresponding vertices are written in order as well. Okay, so triangle PQR is congruent to triangle XYZ. This means that vertex P corresponds to vertex X. Look at this. Vertex Q corresponds to vertex Y. That means they're both in the same position. And vertex R corresponds to vertex Z. Okay, so if you look at example 1 in triangle COD, So if triangle COD is congruent to triangle ATM, name the congruent angles and sides. So let's take a look at this one. So when you talk about congruent sides, okay, and angles, let's see with these two congruent triangles where the corresponding angles are. When you say angle COD is congruent to angle ATM, that means angle C corresponds to angle A, and they are congruent to each other. And we have angle O corresponds to angle T, and both of them are congruent. And then you have angle D is congruent to angle M, because they also correspond to each other, and those two triangles are congruent. Okay, so with that said, we know for a fact, okay, that OC is, or segment OC is congruent to segment AT now. OC is congruent to segment TA. If you want to, because I started with OC, that means you need to start with T as well, because both of those angles are congruent. So side OC is congruent to side TA, or side CO is congruent to side AT. Okay, another two more congruent sides. Side CD is congruent to side AM, and side MT is congruent to side DO. Okay, so those are your congruent sides, and let's see how they did it. Name the three pairs of congruent angles by looking at the order of the vertices. We did that first, and then we simply named all of them. Angle C is congruent to angle A, angle O is congruent to angle T, and angle D is congruent to angle M. So with that said, we know since C corresponds to A, okay, and O corresponds to T, segment CO corresponds to segment AT. Similarly, segment OD corresponds to TM, and CD corresponds to AM. Okay, so the congruent sides are as follows. CO is congruent to AT, segment OD is congruent to segment TM, and segment CD is congruent to segment AM. Okay, like we mentioned earlier. Okay, so again, the important thing here is before you do anything, you need to find out where the corresponding angles are. After you find your corresponding angles, you can find your corresponding sides and see which angles and sides are congruent. Okay, let's take a look at example number 2. The corresponding parts of two congruent triangles are marked in the figure. Write a congruent statement for the two triangles. Okay, so if you notice, angle W and angle P are congruent. Okay, angle R and angle T are congruent, and angle S is basically congruent to the same thing. So what we can do is we can write the congruency statement here for the two triangles. We can say that triangle, if I start with W, WSR is congruent to, so since I started with W, then I need to congruent to, I need to start with P, go to S, and T. Triangle P, S, T. There are a few ways to do this. If I start with S, if I say triangle S, R, W, so if you notice, I went S, R, W. That means in this case, I can do S, T, P is congruent to triangle S, T, P. Okay, another way of doing this is if I have triangle, okay, R, W, S, okay, is congruent to, since I started with R, I need to start with T, then I went from R to W, then that means I need to go from T to P and then to S. Okay, T, P, S. There are a few ways of doing this, okay? And after doing that, after finding our statement for the congruence of triangles, we can now list our congruent angles and sides. So we know that angle W is congruent to angle P. We know that angle R is congruent to angle T. And we know that the angle WSR, because they're both named the angle S, so we name this angle with 3 letters. Angle WSR is congruent to angle PST. The only reason, again, why we're doing 3 letters is because S, okay, is connected to 2 angles. To be able to identify them separately, we name this angle with 3 letters, WSR and PST. Okay? So from there, we can easily name our segments. The congruent statement can be written by matching the vertices. Angle TPS, okay, is congruent to angle RWS, this one right here that we talked about. Oh, it's not asking for corresponding sides, so we're good to go with that problem. And the final example, okay, it's going to be in the next page. So roof trusses, going back to our original example, allow a roof to withstand the stress of heavy loads. A roof truss for a particular building is made so that the angle on the left measures 35 degrees. The triangular sides of the truss are to be congruent as marked below. So what should be the measure of angle TSR? So we want to find out the measure of angle TSR. Okay? So TSR is right there. Okay? So first things first, we know that angle R is congruent to angle S. And since angle R has a measure of 35 degrees, we know for a fact that angle S also has a measure of 35 degrees. Easy enough. What should be the measure of TR? So TR is this side. We know also for a fact that side TR is congruent to side TS. And we know also that TS has been given a measure of 20 feet. So TR has also a measure of 20 feet. Okay? And the secret word for this particular lesson would be rockets. The secret word would be rockets. Thank you for watching.